Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Nicholas and this is Literally Graphic. And today for this mainstream Monday we are going to be looking at X-Men Grand Design by Ed Piskor, who apparently got his start doing comics for American Splendor and then did Hip Hop Family Tree, which I've tried to get into in the past, but was a bit discouraged when I discovered it was not on Voices, but we'll probably get back into it at some point. I just wanted to make sure to make this video while I still had this volume in hand before I returned it to the library, because it is quite impressive, and I wanted to make sure you all knew the scale, though I've seen a couple other people talking about it already, so I know there's some comic book people out there who are like, Meepless, you are so far behind the times. So this comic book is a bit of an odd one. It's not original work and it's not just a reprinting either. What Piskor is doing is kind of rehashing the first 30 or so years apparently of the X-Men history, covering a lot of their deeds of valor, as it were, and also just how the group was formed. It starts out with an origin story for Xavier, which I didn't necessarily ever get. Well, I've never really gotten into X-Men. I've definitely been given many more origin stories for Magneto over the years than necessarily Charles Xavier, which is in retrospect a little bit surprising. Looking through the reviews, it is a bit of an awkward sell to people because some of the stories do feel a little bit cobbled together in strange ways, but I do think it fulfills kind of an interesting and at least important role in that, like, there's obviously always going to be more people who are trying to get into X-Men. Many of them now probably much more familiar with indie comics perhaps than with the history of Marvel. So there's definitely a way in which this is a not horrible introduction, and also obviously a bit of a love letter to Silver Age comics, I believe was the period that it's originally published in. I'm definitely not an X-Men aficionado. I've never really actually gotten into them, which seems a bit surprising to me sometimes because of how many people who I identify with the X-Men were kind of their introduction to superhero comics because they were a bit more diverse than other things. I never really got into Marvel's art style. Of all the superhero comics, I was initially drawn back into DC, which generally seems to have a bit more leeway with their art style and obviously has vertigo historically. Now I'm finally getting into Marvel a bit. It was kind of hilarious when I was reading through and suddenly realized that I had definitely been combining Aquaman and Prince Namor in my head, which obviously makes no sense, but they're both Atlanteans and I was never really hugely into either of them, so it wasn't like a conscious thought. It was just Prince Namor obviously showed up in some Black Panther comics and I was just more than a little bit confused apparently in the back of my mind about how all of this fit together. But now it is all straightened out thanks to the Aquaman trailer, I guess. I suddenly remembered that one was Marvel and one was DC. Funny brain. As far as the look of the comic, as you can see, it's pretty fun. I'm not always a huge fan of printed on paper textures, but since this doesn't seem to be necessarily a hugely pretentious work, that it ultimately panned out for me pretty well. And even though, as I said, I'm not terribly into X-Men, but I definitely have a growing interest in them, and so despite the fact that, like, the story, as I said, was a little bit uneven at times and very timeline and laid out this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, because I really love comics and it is really put together quite beautifully, that kind of really helped me get through it. There's also a reprint in the back of, I guess, X-Men's first issue, which I kind of browsed over because a lot of it was just showing the powers of each of the X-Men, which makes sense in a first issue, but since I just read a whole thing about them, seemed a little bit unnecessary. It was kind of interesting how incredibly creepy the men are to Jean Grey, because it's all about when she first showed up. I mean, she did get to put them in their place, but it definitely kind of plays up the entertaining antagonism between men and women. So thankfully, I feel like we're a bit beyond that. And there was definitely, again, since I guess because it was just a series of events, we didn't really get into any of that sort of nonsense. In Piskor's work, there was a little bit of romance, I suppose, because Jean Grey is one of the few girls. But yeah, there was not any like hugely objectionable material for my feminist heart. And that kind of covers it. My review could have just been, ooh, pretty comic, niche story. But I hope my extrapolations from that have been at least mildly entertaining. I will see you all next time, perhaps with more X-Men comics. Some part in the future, somewhere off in the future. I mean, even watching all the X-Men movies would grow my knowledge tenfold. See you all later. Bye. And as always, Literally Graphic is recorded on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation. I live here because of British colonization, Indigenous genocide, and more geographically specific, Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase, which was finalized in 1805 between representatives of the Crown and certain Mississauga peoples. This treaty was a lie and has since been broken many times over. Saying so reflects only my own small steps towards knowing the truth and does nothing for reconciliation.